So just as Phil sorts the slides out, I'd just like to say thank you, Phil, for inviting me. It's my first time to Belfast. I'm not alumni, but I'm delighted to be here. I do feel a little uneasy with the omens being here, standing somewhere between the Titanic berth and Winterfell, but hopefully it'll all end up well. So I was going to say that usual caveats, and I think Ben started the trend yesterday saying that, being, I think he was about number 6 on the list, saying the fact there have been 5 previous talks, that many of the things he was going to say previous speakers had already said. Well, I say to Ben, what luxury being speaker number 6 would be. I'm speaker number 12. The good thing is a lot of the themes that we've heard today, I have links into, I have hooks into. That should be reassuring. I do hope to tell you some things that you don't know. I certainly want to inform you about some of the things that we're doing and why we're doing them. So let's start at the top then. Not the most catchiest of titles, Enabling the IoT Invasion. My favourite one talk I did was IoT Security. It's a lot like fish. But I wanted to get something that really just reminded us, actually, why are we doing security? And IoT invasion, part of that is about, look, IoT is going to happen whether we like it or not. It's coming, so we need to deal with it. But what we need to make sure that we are aware of is that we're interested in security to really help get the benefits. And so I've talked many times before about the Internet of Treats. That's one version of IoT. But about 4 years ago, I was asked to look at security, and so now I look at the Internet of Threats. So key themes for me, make sure we take care of security. Collaboration is a big theme through the IoT Security Foundation. So here we go. Here's me, John Moor, Managing Director of the IoT Security Foundation. Who's speaking? Caveat emptor. I usually describe myself as an expired engineer. This is my training. I've come up through the embedded system space. It's been a long time since I've done that stuff. I had a really interesting conversation with Mary last night about engineers. I took one for the team, I think, last night. But the point is here is that I was asked to look at security, and I really approached looking at it from an engineer's perspective. I try to understand what the problem space is. So I want to pick up on something I think Joe mentioned this morning, journey. One of the things I've learned along the way is that security is a journey, it's not a destination, and it will run and run. So I hope to give you some observations and insights of some of the things that I found out along the way in terms of IoT. Some of you will be familiar with, some of you may not. Let's go. So part 1 of my talk in the journey is how do I assess what's going on? Why am I being asked to look at IoT security? And what I have to say is that when I looked at it, I thought something that was really quite small turned out to be something quite big. And every space I go into, it's almost like a fractal, because you think you're getting the measure of things, and then suddenly the space explodes because it's heavily nuanced. I want to take you back to 2015. 2015, we ran a conference at Bletchley Park, IoT Security Summit, which we think was probably the first in the world. About 3 months later, we did see an American events company saying, come to the IoT Security Summit, the first in the world. And I dropped them an email saying, great, first summit in the world, only 3 months after we've done ours. This is where we were. This is where we started. And as you can see, you've probably seen the headlines. So a word I used at the time as I was expanding my lexicon into security was egregious. I don't use that word so much now. It only occurred to me when I put this slide up. I used to use the word egregious all the time about IoT security. And so you can see here many things that were going on, from baby monitors to traffic lights to insulin pumps, refrigerators, lots of talk about refrigerators. And I think the big story in 2015 was the Jeep hack. I'm sure many of you will be aware of that. But individual examples aside, the key message out of this was that this is where we are. We can't carry on like this if we're serious about IoT. Something needs to be done, and that was the conclusion of the conference. So here's a key question. Who actually owns the challenge? Who's responsible for IoT security? I've put out a couple of quotes here. When we consider that IoT is one of the most complex things ever created by man, this was from a book called Riot Control. I'm delighted that Tyson came along and spoke at our conference last year. and in terms of industrial control systems, that's a fantastic book, one of the best books I've read. It took me a long time to read it. But, you know, I say to Tyson, look, okay, we haven't finished yet. We're only really starting on building out IoT. When you think about IoT, it's completely at odds with security. You know? Again, one of the things I learned very early on is that in terms of trying to manage security, what you want to do is make the attack space really small, as tightly controlled as possible. But then you look at IoT, and IoT is about data, mashing up data from lots of different sources. So it's completely at odds, but we've got to get our heads around it. So in terms of the attack space, it was huge, and it was expanding. If you look at the complexity, it's huge. And again, you know, provenance is a major theme here. So I picked up on this concept about long and porous borders, and that was really, I picked that phrase up because I saw a news report at the time looking at how borders of a country could be penetrated. And, you know, it occurred to me, you know, it's been a while since we tried to do security around the perimeter. But to answer my question, IoT security is a highly distributed moral responsibility, and what I mean by that is it's no longer the preserve of just security experts. Civic society has a responsibility too. So we have to look at the people who are making, providing the technology, we have to look at the users and what's their role in it, but also the end users too. Here's a few takeaways for you. The ugly truth about cyber and IoT security. I love this saying here. You cannot win. The thing about cybersecurity, you can only not lose. At the Bletchley conference, Mike Muller stood up and said, look, you know, the ugly truth is you will get hacked. If you are successful, people will come at you. Not only that, but you may be collateral damage. So we saw with Mirai, you know, the internet was being used as a weapon to attack itself. And those who had been infected were oblivious to the fact that they've been infected and being used as part of a weapon. And of course, NotPetya, Maersk, $300 million loss, that wasn't a hack, collateral damage. And of course, we know about the National Health Service. So the important thing here is that everybody's got a role to play. You know, hygiene is a basic requirement. What I would also say is that when I first started looking at IoT security, because of my previous roles, I was naturally inclined to look at what was going on the leading edge of cybersecurity, because that's where I thought the action would be. What's different about this gig for me from prior roles is actually most of the stuff we need to do is fix the remedial elements of it. If we can start there, then we've got a chance. So what's new? IoT security. It turns out everything and nothing. There's a lot of familiar issues, so I started to look at this concept of what the enemies of security. So here we go, cost, complexity, convenience or inconvenience, the adversaries that are looking to take advantage of the technology, and you know, this introduction of chaos actors now, the attack types and the vectors, and you know, maybe some of the defense methods. I think we're going to need to think about new defense methods. So the good thing about this is that what it means in terms of IoT security is we kind of know what we need to do. The difference is, though, is that that knowledge is not perfectly spread. There are asymmetries, and that's one of the roles of the IoT Security Foundation. But it's also evolving. If we look at what's going on in IoT, the players, their supply chains, the markets, the scale and scope of the opportunity, the operating and regulatory environments, the potential for physical harm, and I think this was a key differentiator for me in terms of traditional cyber as opposed to IoT, this element of kinetic or physical harm, because we have physical actuation in systems. That was the big thing. And so where the emphasis moves away from confidentiality, moves into integrity and availability. And of course, we're talking about tech, headless devices. True IoT will not be what we see today, which is an app on your phone which you control an IoT device. It will tend towards what we were traditionally talking about, machine to machine. And then there's, I talk about the skills, there's a little diagram here. But again, in terms of my journey, the first thing I did was immerse myself into an InfoSec conference. And one of my first experiences, I was listening to a panel, and the lady at the front says, you know, I do not sleep at night because I'm worried about the data. It's all about the data, all about the data. And although I promised myself I wouldn't speak, I did. I said, well, what about the system? What if the system goes down? Completely different mindset. And so if we look at my entry point from embedded systems, I'm thinking about systems, InfoSec, traditional IT, think about data. So here we are. Let me see, have I covered most of that? I think we have. So it's a dynamic and maturing world. I think there's new challenges. Security hygiene is not just the preserve of security experts. That's something else that we saw too. We saw security people talking to security people. That's not necessarily the right conversation. We need to open that box out. And also this thing, even security experts, not infallible. I think at the time I read a really good book by Brian Krebs on Spam Nation, and in there was a part about how actually some of the compromises that have come about in the internet, because even people who were experts who were Cisco certified were configuring equipment wrong. So I submit to you, this is the end of part one of the journey, by the way. IoT security is a wicked challenge. This is where it's taken me. It's significantly more than a technical challenge. It must include users, business motivation, process, engineering process I've missed out here. It's taken me to societal, economic and cultural aspects, geopolitical, philosophical and ideological dimensions too. And there's probably more, and your own in. So that's setting the scene. So what do we do? Do we just keep complaining about it? Well, we didn't think so. This is 2015. We concluded the need is now. Let's get ready. Let's do something. After the conference, we knew we had to have a reaction. We didn't exactly know what that would be. We went through a consultation period, and we ended up forming the IoT Security Foundation. We said, no more Project Fear. We used that pre-Brexit. No more Project Fear. We've got to do something to address the problem. And we need to make it safe to connect. And I credit Ben with that, because Ben Asvine from BT, because he's on our board, by the way, disclosure there. One of the first conversations I had with Ben, he said, John, I've been thinking about this. What we really need to do is make it safe to connect. And so we took that, and that was our starting tagline. So how do we do it? Well, we need industry. Industry needs to move at market speed. We need to give them tools that they can use and consume very quickly. We also have to recognize that perfect security is asymptotic. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We need to put basic controls in. I wanted to share this with you. This is actually still in draft, but it's something, how we are thinking about how we construct our materials and our outputs. What we'd like to do is have a model that really recognizes that the audience, our customers, if you like, for best practices, really there is a spectrum of users. Some will be more advanced than others, some will be more mature, some are starting right from the very beginning. So we need to have something which is accessible from those who are new to security, and particularly for me, it is a lot of those companies who are quite mature. They've been making products for many years, but they've never had connectivity. And this is the thing, this is the fallacy that we saw, is that to put connectivity into a product is really quite cheap. Bolting Wi-Fi in is very cheap, but the implications of that is really quite profound. And that's something we found that organizations didn't really understand. So how do we cater for diverse needs? How do we increase the manufacturer's confidence in their own abilities? But even more so, how do we make sure that we provide the market with some assurance? All with a backdrop of uncertainty around regulatory landscape. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But how do we make sure that that is all aligned, and how can we make sure that regulation doesn't happen in a vacuum? So that's the principle then. How do we move people up this assurance scale for those benefits? What we first started looking at was, can we get companies starting from here, they've nothing, to the point where they say, well, actually, we do understand our security now. We understand where the holes are because we have this framework that has been provided for us. And if we can get them to that point, will they get to a point where they say, do you know what, we are confident, so we're happy to tell the world that we self-certify against something. And if they're going to self-certify, could we actually get them all the way up to a third-party assessment? Here's one of the practical tools that we use, and we really see this as a harmonizing document. The IoT Security Compliance Framework, this is where we gather all of the security requirements that we can see which are useful for product developers, and we capture them in a document. And it covers many areas. It's not just the technical controls, there's business process and a few other things in here too. to accompany that, there is a questionnaire. And the questionnaire, we used to term this the technical construction file, and this is where you gather evidence as to how you engineer your products. Within the questionnaire, it's perfectly okay to say this part is not applicable to us. But essentially, you have to justify why it's not applicable to you, so you just don't scrape out half the requirements. A supporting piece of documentation is a security design best practice guide. There's a working group on this. The brief that we gave them is we said we need to break security down into bite-sized chunk. What you can do is present a subject with one page. That's all you can have, one page to introduce it. But we must have jump-off points to more subject matter detail. I will add that a key point about this, when we're talking about cost, it was a decision from the steering board that all our materials are free to download, free at the point of use, because we wanted to address that element of cost. So all of these materials I'm showing to you today are freely available from the website. Then we got into, well, let's give some examples of what does good look like. And so we have a number of architectures that we've published. Interesting, context is king. We did a security architecture here for a hub in the home, and that was really targeted towards hub manufacturers, because obviously, not so obvious, but the key point here is for consumers, you cannot expect them to have security knowledge, so you need to do it all in the hub. We did one for enterprise. That's a slightly different emphasis, because you can assume that enterprises have some professionals who are looking out for security. So can we give them an example of how to deal with IoT as these devices come into your organization? Can you do it in a scalable way? We've got a few more coming soon. Probably later this month we'll publish one on healthcare, and a little bit later in the year we'll do something on automotive. The automotive will be slightly different. It will probably be at the principal stage. If you go into the automotive space, there are already, my sources tell me, at least 5 architectures that are already in existence. So this really will be for coming at it from new suppliers who are looking from an IoT perspective. Now then, picking up on something Joe spoke about just earlier, we talked about responsible disclosure. Well, we call that vulnerability disclosure for historical reasons. One of the things which was interesting to me in my journey is that I started to hear people talking about responsible disclosure, vulnerability disclosure, and coming from the embedded world. I didn't know what that was about, but clearly people in the information security world know all about that. So I said, what is that? And it was explained to me, and it was a very simple concept, and I thought that's really powerful. That's something that we need to educate all of those embedded companies about. And we know there's a lot of games that go on in terms of responsible disclosure. So we put a best practice guide together for that. Again, very light to help educate providers of IoT products that they must have a vulnerability disclosure policy. But we also went a bit further, and we said, okay, in the world of consumer, how widely practiced is vulnerability disclosure? And so we looked globally in retail, and we identified 331 companies, and I suspect you won't be shocked to hear that less than 10% of those companies had a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. Now that's not great, but in a way it is good, because now we have some numbers to put on it. And what we can do is help promote it as a key feature of, if you're going to play in the IoT space, you must do the basics. So hopefully, if we're going to do this thing in the future, we'll see that number go up. Regulation is a hot topic. We published a report. I won't go too much into the detail here, but what we wanted to get to the point of for manufacturers is to try to take out the complacency that we were seeing, because they were saying, well, there's no regulation for us. And we were saying, actually, there is. So we did a report looking at 5 regions around the world, 3 policies out of each. And out of that, the headline was, actual fact, there's no convenient IoT cybersecurity regulation, but you can be got from some of the traditional areas, such as consumer protection rights, child protection, telecoms, and of course the emerging one in data protection and cybersecurity. That leads me neatly into this slide. Actually, consumer end of IoT. IoT covers many spectrums, as we know. It'll cover medical, transport, industrial, as we've heard. The consumer space is a place that we decided that we would start our work purely because that's where we saw most of the crimes happening, which we felt towards cybersecurity because of the lack of regulation and because of many of the headlines that we were seeing. So we were delighted that last year, UK government, DCMS, produced a draft report, Secure by Design, looking at consumer IoT. Now, when I put this slide together, what I wanted to tell you about was regulation that's coming. But, you know, when I thought about it, the bigger thing for us in this room and being part of the UK is that the speed at which this has happened, because there is a very real need, and the very fact that the UK is leading on this, and we're very much seen as leading the regulation discussion, is fantastic for us. Because cybersecurity, when we go into this digital world, is absolutely fundamental. And UK are leaders. We very much are. We're seen this way around the world. We've heard that already over the last couple of days. But very quickly, you know, so there were 13 guidelines in the Code of Practice, which came out in the original Secure by Design report. We actually mapped the framework that we have to support those 13 guidelines, and that was the mapping we did. Very quickly, DCMS took the design report, they took the draft report, they finalised it, and they've moved it into an ETSI technical spec. Very quickly. This happened, as the date says here, February 19. Very short window. In standards terms, that's almost unprecedented, the speed of which that moved. This is UK. And I can, you know, we work very closely with the guys at DCMS. They're very keen to push this as fast as they can, and they're going very fast. Key point here is there's a consultation that's just been opened, May 1st, to look at the regulatory proposals on consumer IoT. If this is of interest to you, I suggest you feed into that consultation. That's pretty much it from me. I mean, that was, I realised I had 20 minutes, and there was a lot to say, not a lot of time to say it, but I hope I've given you a flavour of what we're about. You know, fundamentally, the IoT Security Foundation, I didn't mention that we're a non-profit organisation. We are really trying to attack IoT security on two dimensions. One is to raise the quality of solutions, but also the pervasiveness, because that's the point. IoT, we're all connected, so you can't just do bits of it, you have to do it all. We firmly entered the digital transformation, or the IoT invasion. I picked up from Joe's talk yesterday, and I think I might adapt this to the fifth dimension. The fifth domain. I think I might include that in future. But in order for us to realise the full potential of IoT, we've all got a role to play. And so we started picking up on this concept of key audiences that we needed to communicate to. And so we said, well, the manufacturers, we need to talk to those guys. So let's make sure that they build secure. And then we felt, you know, the users of IoT, the companies that were bringing IoT into their companies, we need to get them to be asking for security. Very fundamental. So can we influence purchasers? So that's where the Buy Secure came in. And then finally, the end users. Could be employees, could be consumers. We need to make sure they do their bit. Basic hygiene. Make sure they take care of their passwords, make sure they're strong enough, make sure they update their software. So I outlaid this to our members, and I said, look, you know, we're going to pick this up as you know, part of our mantra. So we want to build secure, buy secure, be secure. And one of my members put his hand up and said, John, that's great. That's 3 BSs. And I said, that's fantastic, because if that's the way you remember it, then I'm delighted. And indeed, I wrote a blog post which said why IoT security needs more BS, and it's around those 3 key audiences. One last thing. We do run an annual conference. We just announced this. It's November 26th. It's in London. We've put out a call for papers. If you've got something to say, we invite you to submit a paper. If you want to hear more, please come along. And I'll leave you with our values. These were our founding values. Security first. I think I'm preaching to the choir on that. Fit for purpose is an important point. As we know, you know, the security is heavily influenced by the context that you place it into. So you wouldn't do the same in consumers you would in medical or automotive, for example. But you know, we've heard about resilience this morning. For me, coming from the embedded space, that was a significant aspect, because what it means is we need to take care of the product, the engineering through the operating life. It's no longer pass it over to a different set of teams. And that's got actually profound implications. And from an expired engineer, I can see engineering processes will have to change massively to deal with this. So that's me done. Any questions?